started something called as state management. I'll just quickly give you an overview of what we have discussed as part of state management, so that you will be in flow and you will understand what we are discussing. Fine. So when we are talking about HTTP, any web-based application, whether it is your Java or Java-based web application or .NET-based web application or PHP-based application, whatever web application it is, most of the time or 100% they are dependent on only one protocol for web communication, because web supports only one protocol. What is that? What is that? HTTP, right? So HTTP has a unique feature associated with it, and that feature is called as your HTTP is called as stateless protocol. What is that? Stateless protocol. Sai Krishna, is it making sense? Good. Why is HTTP called as stateless protocol? Let me explain that to you. So before understanding why it is called a stateless protocol, let's try to understand what is meant by maintaining state. So think that you are on a web page, something like a form which contains all the details which you should be filling in, and you should on submit, the form would be submitted to the client. Fine, something like that, a application form. Got it? And earlier we understood that the business logic or the functionality associated with your code would be residing either on your server side, which happens mostly, and sometimes it may also exist on client side if there is no complex business logic. Fine. However, as we discussed earlier, most of the time the business logic exists on your server side, which means C# code or VB code, right? So when you are talking about your C# code, your C# code gets compiled and converted into DLLs, right? So where will the DLL where will the DLL be residing? It resides on your server, so it doesn't exist on your client side, right? So whenever you have to execute a server side functionality, a call would be made to the server. Got it? So what happens, for example, think of a Sneha, are you getting it or not? Good. So when we are talking about a server side request or a request to the server, let's try to understand it with an example. Think that there is a requirement which says that on change of your, there are three different drop down lists, and first drop down list displays all the states in United States, and the second drop down will display the cities in a particular state which is selected in the first drop down, and third one says that you on selection of the state and city, you should be displaying the zip codes associated with that city. Got it? Good. So this change, there is a business logic associated with it, which says that on changing the selection associated with your drop down list, a call should be made to the server, and the server should populate the second drop down with all the cities in that state, right? Yes or no? So for this, you will be making a call to the server. However, the unique feature associated with your HTTP is that the every request received by your server would be considered as a new request, because the HTTP cannot retain any data. So every request made to a server would be considered as a new request. So think that there are multiple fields which were typed in or which were filled up before selecting the drop down list. All those will be lost, right? Because the server assumes that it's a new request. It assumes that it's a new request, and it will send the data associated with the new request, which makes your data which you have already filled in that form lost, right? So ideally, this is not the scenario which you would be wanting. Do you want to fill in the data every time you make a selection change in your drop down list? Nobody wants that to happen, right? So in this way, HTTP is a stateless protocol because it cannot retain the data between multiple calls to the server, or each and every consecutive call to the server is treated as a new request. So for that reason, the data is not retained, or state of the application or current state of the application is not retained between two consecutive requests to the server. Making sense now? Did you understand why it is called as a stateless protocol? However, this drawback associated with your HTTP has to be somehow mitigated, right? So the techniques which we use to mitigate the to mitigate the data, or mitigate the data loss, or to mitigate the problem with retaining the state between multiple calls to the server, are called as state management techniques, right? And every technology will have certain techniques which can be implemented or which can be used to maintain the state of the application. Got it? And .NET also has certain techniques which you can use to maintain the state of the application between multiple calls to the server. And when we are talking about state, we understood that that is the data associated with the current user's current request state, right? So when we are talking about maintaining the data between multiple calls to the server, it should be saved somewhere, right? So otherwise you can't retain it. So it should be saved somewhere, and when the new request response is received, you will add the data which you have saved to the request to make it look like the earlier version, right? Yes or no? Good. So saving it temporarily requires some memory, right? Some amount of memory is required for saving the state. One second, please. So, based, yes, cache is one concept associated with state management, but there can be multiple other ways to do it. We'll look at each and every technique associated with this. Fine. So based on the place where, or the which type of memory you are using, there are two different types of state management techniques. Your total state management techniques can be grouped into two different types. The first type of state management technique, or first group of state management techniques, are called as client side state management techniques. What are they called as? Client side state management techniques. Why are they called as client-side state management techniques? Because you are using the client's memory resources to save them, right? What is client here? Here the client is your system's local browser, right? So if you are using the browser's memory resources, or the client's local machine's memory resources for maintaining the state, then that is called as your client-side state management technique. Making sense? However, if you are using the server's resources or server's memory resources to save the state of your application between multiple consecutive calls to the server, then that technique is called as a server-side state management technique. Understood? Sneha, is it clear? Sneha, is it making sense? Are you there, Sneha? I think she's not there. Okay, no problem. So when we are talking about client-side state management techniques, there are multiple client-side state management techniques, and the first among them is your cookies. Do you know what is cookies? Good. If you look at your browser, you'll see that there is some type of setting called as manage your cookies or something like that would be there. right? So it says allow data or block the cookies or something like that, right? So what are cookies here? Cookies are temporary text files which are saved in your client side local machines temporary memory in form of text files, so that they can be used, data can be saved into these text files, and they can be used whenever it is required, right? So a cookie would be saved in form of small text file. Understood? So if you look at your machine's temporary data, you'll see there will be multiple text files created. Fine. All these are your cookies. Understood? Good. So these cookies can be used to save the data temporarily on your client's local machine. Now tell me, is there any drawback associated with saving your cookies in your client's local machine in form of text file? Is there any drawback associated with it? Do you see any drawback? Slow? No. Anything else? There are multiple drawbacks associated with it. Let me explain. The first drawback associated with it is, if when we looked at the settings associated with your cookies, you'll see that there is a setting which says block third-party cookies and site data, right? So what does this mean? This means your end client can block the cookies which are required by your application. So if he has blocked the cookies on his browser, then your application will not function if you are using cookies, right? Yes or no? Good. The second drawback, we were able to retrieve the cookies directly, right? Anyone who has access to the client's local machine can access the cookies, right? And think that somebody accessed it and 1 second, somebody accessed it and changed the data or tampered the data. Is it okay? Is it okay? It's possible, right? Is it okay? It's not okay, right? Because your data will be lost and it is not secure. So the drawbacks are, the client can restrict the cookies which can affect your functionality, and the second drawback is that your cookies can be tampered by any person who has access to the client's local machine, right? So those are the drawbacks associated with your cookies. So the next, we will look at the practice associated with it in our next class, but in our today's class we'll try to understand what are the different techniques used for state management. Okay, so the second technique associated with your state management is called as hidden field. Do you know what is a hidden field? No? Good. Let me show you what is a hidden field. Before understanding what is a hidden field, let me explain you what is a field first. Okay, let me open the Visual Studio. Still opening. Good. Let me search for something called as hidden field here. There are multiple controls on this page, right? You see a drop down list, you see a drop down list again, you see a text box, you see a label, right? You see a button here. So each and every individual control existing on a given page can also be called as a field. Fine. So if you see, there is one other field here called as your hidden field. So what is the value of it? Testing hidden field. Okay, that's the value of it. Let me run this and show you the unique feature of your hidden field and why it is called as a hidden field. Are you able to see all the controls which are existing on the page here? This is the button, this is the button, and this is the text box. These are the drop down lists, right? You were able to see all the fields, but you were unable to see the hidden field even in a scenario where it is having a value associated with it, right? So that is the unique feature associated with your hidden field. It will not be visible on the user interface. That's the reason why it is called as hidden. Fine. However, let me show you. There is a feature associated with your browser. If you have observed anytime, you can right click on it and you can click on something called as view source. It will take you to the DOM or the HTML associated with it, right? If you see, the hidden field which you have created is still existing on the page, right? But it is not visible. Making sense? I'll tell you. So did you understand what is the unique feature of your hidden field? Good. Now you can use this hidden field to save the data between multiple calls to the server. Whatever data you want to save, you can assign it as the value of the hidden field and it will be saved. And you can retrieve it back from the hidden field whenever you want to use it. Making sense? So in that way, it can be used for state management on the client side, right? What are the drawbacks? Do you see any drawbacks associated with your hidden field? Any drawbacks associated with using your hidden field? anyone who has access to the page can click on view source and see the value of your hidden field, right? It's not secure. And sometimes if you can write a proper script, you can also tamper this if you are a good hacker, right? So it's not secure. Good. So these are the drawbacks associated with your hidden field. What are the drawbacks associated with your cookie? Cookie can be deleted, or it can be disabled, or it can be tampered, right? Good. Next, I'm not sure if you were there in that class when we have discussed the stages associated with your ASP.NET page lifecycle. But let me explain you some important term which we have discussed there, called as your view state. Fine. So what is view state? Every form, every control existing on your form and the form altogether will have some property associated with it called as view state, and this property is used for temporarily saving some data. Fine. So this is a temporary space or temporary memory associated with each and every control on your page and the page altogether, right? So this can be used for saving your state of the application again, right? You can use it, right? There is a temporary memory available on the client side. You can go ahead and use it, right? Good. Now we'll see the drawbacks of your view state. Do you see something called as view state existing on your page? Good. So what is the type of it? Hidden. So what does that mean? View state is again using hidden fields to save the data, right? Then how is it different from your hidden field? If you see, are you able to understand the value of the view state here? No. Are you able to understand the value of your hidden field here? Yes. So what is the difference between both of them? The difference is that your view state value or data in your view state would be saved in encoded format. So nobody can look at it or nobody can understand it, right? So that's the in that way it is a bit more secure, right? Encoding. It's not encryption, it's encoding. 1 second please, 1 second please. Fine. So this is encoding, not encryption. Fine. Encoding means you will just use any encoding algorithms like MD5, or there are multiple encoding algorithms, okay, followed across the market. So they will be using any encoding algorithm, or they can create their own customized encoding algorithm also, which can be used for saving the data on your view state. Got it? Do you see any drawbacks here again? You can't understand it, but still you can tamper it if you are a good hacker, right? In that way, it's also not 100% efficient. So, did you understand what is a cookie? What is a hidden field? What is a view state? Good. Now, there is something else called as your query string. I will tell you what is a query string. Fine. There is a website like this, okay, in which you are trying to buy a tire, okay, a car tire. You have given all the data and you are able to see the different types of tires available in the market from different companies, right? Are you able to see that? So you are trying to get the details of this particular tire, okay, and here when you click on it, a new request would be made to the server, and however that request will require the ID associated, product ID associated with this tire, right, which is present on this page. So how will you send it? You need some state management technique to do that, right? So if you see, your URL is getting modified to add a new parameter at the end of it called as part number, right? And this is the ID associated with it, right? So this part is called as your query string. Fine. So your query string also can be used to maintain state of the application. What is the drawback associated with it then? Anyone can see it, right? And by default, most of the browsers have a restriction which says that the address of the URL should not be more than 256 characters. In recent past, they have increased it to 1024, but still there is a restriction. So you can't save large amount of data in your query string, right? That's one other drawback. One second, please. Okay, sorry guys, I just got some call. So did you understand the drawbacks associated with query string now? Is it clear? Any questions? No, right? Good. So these are the drawbacks associated with your query string. So these are the techniques which can be used on your client side for maintaining your state of the application or state management. Got it? Now, there are two different ways to do it on your server side. Again, before getting into individual details of the server side state management techniques, let's try to understand what resources on your server side you can be using, right? So you would require some memory for saving your data, right? So how will you use what resources can be used for maintaining or for using the systems resources or servers resources on server side? So we discussed it earlier, right? So for accessing the resources of your server, like the server's memory or like the server's CPU, you will be requiring something called as a process, right? We understood it earlier. Yes or no? Good. So there should be some process which can be used for saving the state of the application or saving the memory, right? Good. So so what process is that? So that would be called as your worker process. Okay, we discussed it earlier itself. So this process which can be used by your application to utilize the memories sorry server's memory and system resources is called as your worker process or ASP.NET worker process, right? Good. Now let's try to understand the two different techniques which can be used on your server side for maintaining the state of your application. So first state management technique on your server side is called as your session state or session object. Fine. So this would be the session object is a object which can be uh, restricted or which is restricted to a particular user session. Okay, let me explain it with an example better. So think that there is an application like Google and it has some session management techniques involved, so you can use session objects on your Google. Fine. So think that at a given point of time you are using the Google and I am using the Google as well. Fine. So both the user sessions, the session which is running on your machine and the session which is running on my machine, both of them, they have created few session objects, right? So the scope of these session objects which are created by a particular user session will be restricted to that particular user session only. So if the application or session running on your machine has created some session objects, I will not be able to access it. And if my user session has created some session objects, you will not be able to access it. Fine. And these session objects would be using the server's resources through the worker process for saving the data. Got it? Good. So however, by default it would be using the worker process only. However, there can be some drawbacks associated with it, right? So for example, think that there is a you have some 1 GB or 2 GB of RAM on your memory, okay, on your server, and your session object is trying to utilize it. Fine. Okay, so in this case in this case hmm, fine. So in this case, you have created 10 session objects which use 10 MB of memory, so you are using 100 MB, and I have created 10 objects and I am using 100 MB, right? So in that way, if there are 20 users, your system's default memory will not be sufficient for saving the session, right? So your worker process cannot bear that load. Yes or no? So in this type of scenarios, you will be using some secondary resources or some other way for maintaining your session objects or maintaining your session state. So if you are using the worker process created by your application for saving the session state, then that is called as in-proc. And if you are using the system's resources if you are using some other explicit mechanism for that, then that is called as your out-proc. So there are two different ways of maintaining your state on maintaining your session state on your server side. One is called as in-proc, and other one is called as out-proc. Got it? In-proc uses the worker process by default, and out-proc you can use a newly created process on a different server, so that you can explicitly use that process for your session state only. Fine. And if you are doing that, then that is called as state server mode of session state. Fine. And you can also use a database for this purpose. If you are using a database, SQL Server database for this purpose, then that is called as outproc mode or SQL Server mode. Fine. Both state server and your SQL Server mode are the different types of state management techniques in outproc mode, but one uses a new process created on a different server, and other one uses database. Got it? Understood? Good. Fine. That's it for today. I'll share the notes with you, and I'll give you an assignment as well. So please go through the notes and uh, explain different types of state management techniques we have looked at till now. Okay, in a document. Can we do it by tomorrow? Good. Awesome. Thanks so much for joining. We'll drop off for today. Thank you. Thanks, Sai Krishna. Thanks, Neha. Good night. Bye. Hello. Yeah, Nirmal, tell me.